Om Namah Shivaya all. A warm greetings and hearty welcome to the online seminar on cultural anthropology and indigenous ways of being. It is indeed my pleasure and honor to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Marilyn Walker, Professor Emeritus from Mount Allison University, Canada. Dr. Marilyn Walker, PhD, started out as an archaeologist working in the Canadian North, then became involved in heritage preservation and museum curatorial work in the Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada. As a university professor of anthropology and specialized in indigenous studies, medical anthropology, and ethnobotany, Dr. Walker has involved in extensive fieldwork across Canada and the US, in Siberia, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, and India. She is especially interested in shamanism, and her explorations in shamanism have been personal as well as academic. Her interests are focused on the benefits of traditional shamanism for addressing personal and societal problems today, and in supporting shamans around the world who have suffered so much cultural repression but are now experiencing a renaissance. Having completed the Michael Harner's 3-year program of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, Dr. Walker was invited to become a field associate with the Foundation of Southeast Asia, Siberia, and North America, a founding member of the Society for Shamanic Practitioners and a past member of the Society for Anthropology of Religion and for the Explorers Club. She has given papers and workshops nationally and internationally and authored scholarly and popular articles on shamanism, as well as 4 books on ethnobotany, shamanism, and sacred geometry. Her fieldwork, research and teaching, and publications have been supported by the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museums of Canada, the Royal Ontario Museum, as well as national and international funding agencies. Dr. Marilyn is now retired as Professor Emeritus from Mount Allison University, Canada. We are excited to have Dr. Marilyn online here with us, and with great pleasure, I invite Dr. Marilyn to the session. I also add that the audience are welcome to post the questions to Dr. Marilyn in the chat, and she'll be addressing the same at the end of each section. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Marilyn.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I am retired, and I have been retired for about 7 or 8 years now. So what I will be talking about is some of the research that I carried out both during my PhD work and when I was a professor at Mount Allison University. So I'm going to start out by, next slide, please. So I'm starting out with exploring some terms, like what is indigenous? Because every nation seems to have a group of people who are a tribal and ethnic minority or a subculture that are called indigenous because they are the original peoples of an area. But everywhere in the world, and certainly in the areas that I've worked in, indigenous peoples are in a very precarious relationship with the dominant culture or with the state. Now, and I'll speak about some of those specifically as we go through. All indigenous peoples, and in fact, all cultures are shamanist by tradition, even where shamans no longer exist, because in many parts of the world, shamans have been exterminated. They've been murdered, sent to concentration camps, and have suffered horrendous persecution. But at the same time, many shamanist beliefs and practices have been adopted by dominant cultures, and so have blended with religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. So the case studies that I'm going to address from my fieldwork in shamanist traditions in North America, especially in northern Canada, also in Siberia, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, and a little bit in India. I made 3 visits to India, once to visit the ashram, once to teach a course for Queen's University on Indigenous studies, and once before that when I went to study shamanism and gave a talk at Thule University. So one of the things that's happening in North America anyway is the recognition that Indigenous peoples all over the world have a role to play in furthering our own development. And so the United Nations has set up an International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. And in particular, this year, 2022, the day is looking at the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge, with the recognition that women, especially Indigenous women, have been written out of history. And so this is one way of starting to revitalize and recognize and pay respect to these very ancient traditions, and also to see how they can be relevant to our future, and integrating what they have known for generations to support our own, let's say, our own development. Next, please. So there are 5 subfields of anthropology, and please excuse me if I'm repeating things that you already know. But 5 subfields of anthropology: linguistics, physical anthropology, archaeology, and cultural anthropology. But there's a newer field called action anthropology, or applied anthropology. And that's the area that I've been most interested in, although I have worked as an archaeologist. But even when I was doing archaeology, it was the idea of applying anthropological principles and concepts to furthering the archaeological work. So action anthropology or applied anthropology includes research methodologies such as PAR, or participatory action research. Amongst the objectives of PAR are social change, social justice, empowerment, and the evolution of equality. And PAR also is looking at or trying to develop what I call emergent methodologies, and I'll speak about some of those later, such as narrative, whereby people tell their stories in terms that are meaningful to them. So much of my work has been listening to people's stories, but also studying traditional music, dance, even embroidery, and other expressive arts, because they tell me much about particular identity and what is meaningful to that particular group. And so these are what I would call emergent methodologies, because of course the classic way of doing anthropology was for an anthropologist, usually a male, to go into the field for a very long time, and often would have a set of questions, or be in a kind of authoritative position to define what would be researched. And usually those earlier anthropologists were males speaking to other men, perhaps because they didn't have access to women and to women's knowledge. So there is a great emphasis now on including women who've been marginalized to a great extent in these new what I would call emergent methodologies. So anthropology as an academic discipline comes from a background of patriarchy, colonization, and hegemony. It is based in fieldwork, but classic anthropology implied the duality of self and other, or subject and object. And that was a way of setting up oneself as the anthropologist as the authority, usually in a privileged position. And of course, that kind of distinction of self and other, or subject and object, is very problematic in a spiritual sense. And I'm hoping that anthropology will develop as more of a humanistic discipline with an understanding of spirituality as meaningful, not just to people who are being studied, but to the anthropologist, his or herself. Next, please. So there have been developing what we would call decolonizing methodologies. So methodologies that recognize that the relationship between indigenous peoples and the colonizer. Decolonizing methodologies are recognizing that anthropology was a colonial approach to research, and that what is needed now is a more participatory and inclusive and social justice kind of relationship between anthropology and the peoples that anthropology is engaged with. So some of the terminology that's coming up in more current anthropological research are terms like claiming, testimony, storytelling, indigenizing an approach, that is making an approach coming from the ground up instead of from the top down. Intervention, revitalization, connecting, even reading and writing of people's experience by people themselves rather than by an outsider. Representing and gendering, that is recognizing that gender disparity has permeated all of the anthropological literature. And even in the West, we're starting to see a change from talking about history to talking about her story. So much is happening in terms of language. Envisioning, reframing, restoring, democratizing, networking, naming, protecting, creating, negotiating, discovering, sharing, returning. Repatriation is a big issue. Repatriation of museum collections, for example. I just donated 2 very large collections to 2 different, one to the government of the Northwest Territories, where I used to work, and one to the University of British Columbia, so that materials that I collected personally have gone somewhere where they will be of use to other people, including the communities themselves. And also a celebrating of Indigenous ways of being, recognizing that they have been resilient and have survived. Next, please. Now, I don't see any chat, but if you would like to put a question in the chat, I'm happy to try and answer it, especially if it's about any of the sections. And there's also time at the end for more general discussion. So my own background as an archaeologist, for example, I think I was quite young, maybe 18 or something, and I worked on what's called the Thule Archeology Conservation Project. And that was a participatory and action-based or land claims research project. And one of the things that we were doing was documenting archaeological sites that were being washed away with global warming. They were being washed away into the ocean. So we were there using, working with native guides and interpreters to document these very important sites. And one of the reasons they were important was because they showed the long-term habitation of the area by Inuit people that you may know more by the name of Eskimo people, but now called Inuit or the people. And land claims research has been huge. So many indigenous nations are asking for their land to be returned to them since it was removed by, for example, in Canada, was taken by the Canadian government. Indigenous people here were moved on to reserves. Or my background is also in medical anthropology, and I was very interested in the Tibetan system and of medicine. I'll speak a little bit about that later, and also the Thai system. And in Thailand, food is very important as medicine. Food is considered to be medicine. So one of my main areas of research has been ethnobotany, that is documenting how people relate to plants, including how they categorize them even. Because we do have a universal system of classifying plants, which is based in Latin. It's a binomial system. But indigenous peoples, different cultures, classify plants according to a huge variety of different ways. So when you go into a different culture, yes, you might, for research purposes, you might identify a plant by its Latin name, but you want to know how people relate to that plant. What is the meaning of that plant to them? And is it different from how Western classification operates? And I also worked for many years in museums and heritage conservation, including repatriation, such as the building of museums in different parts of the far north here, and also oral history projects to document people's memories about their own pasts. And so indigenous peoples everywhere have suffered from oppression. Many have been alienated from their homelands and face common challenges such as language loss. Perhaps you've heard that recently one of the last speakers of the Canadian native language died. And also they've lost their traditional spirituality, which is based in shamanism. So amongst the places I've worked, I'm going to show you some ethnographic research projects to illustrate more general concepts in theory and methodology. And again, that's unusual because most anthropologists in their career focus on one area, but I've been more interested in what I call pan-shamanism or pan-indigenous knowledge. That is what's common to cultures that may be very separate in time and space. And the next one, please. So two things that were said to me very early on in my career, and they've affected my entire career. I remember when I was very young, I think 16, the first time I went to live in an Inuit community in the far north. And I said, you know, I don't really feel I'm here to, to do this research. I don't feel very comfortable about it. And, elders said to me, you have to tell your people about us. And so that kind of defined what I saw as my role as being a kind of translator of cultures rather than someone as an authority on either one. And I was also told that we will tell, and this was in Thailand, we will tell you a little more than you already know. And so that put me in a position of being a student always. Of always, making a little bit more of an inroad into understanding the unfamiliar. And so it makes me not an authority on anything that I'm presenting. I'm not an authority on what I'm going to show you. I just want to present my own experiences. So there is a term in anthropology, perhaps you've heard of it, it's called culture shock, about what happens to anthropologists going into the field and being confronted with all these different ways of being, of doing things, of whether you shake hands or you bump foreheads or whatever, or if you, maybe very, very different food that you are having to eat. But I always found I got culture shock returning to my own culture. And that was because I found Indigenous communities work from the heart. They value the heart over the mind, I would say. And they value you as a person and how you are, not on what you represent, or not on what your position is, or how wealthy you are, but just on how you treat people and how you I guess on a shared humanity of some kind. Next one, please. So this is a definition on Indigenous knowledge from Canada. And I'll just read it very quickly. There's no single definition of Indigenous knowledge. It's a term that refers to a set of complex knowledge systems based on the worldviews of Indigenous peoples. And in Canada, we have First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, each very distinct ways of describing their own knowledge. But some of the commonalities in all Indigenous cultures are the value such as stewardship. So, Indigenous people feel that they are stewarding the land on behalf of Great Spirit or the divine or God or whatever term they use. And that's very different from a Western idea of ownership of the land. And there's a very important idea of balance, that you have to maintain balance in yourself, within yourself, between your mind, your heart, your body, and your spirit. And also you have to be in balance with your community, and also you have to be in balance with the other world. There's a recognition that the natural world can teach us everything we need to know. And so we need to be in balance with the rhythm of the seasons. And there's an idea that's common to all Indigenous peoples, and that is that life is a circle. And so we start out as an infant, we move into adolescence, into adulthood, and then into elderhood. And then we die and are born again into this never-ending circle of life. And there are also the values of respect, gratitude, and that means you make offerings to Great Spirit or to God or to the Lord. And here you can see someone in the Maritimes in Eastern Canada growing what's called sacred tobacco, not for smoking, but as an offering, because tobacco is one of the most sacred plants in North America, and it's burned as a sign of respect. And of course, there's the common idea of creator or great spirit, who is responsible for all of the plenitude that we benefit from. So next, please. Oh, and I see there is a question in the chat. I'm sorry if I missed it. Let's see if I can find it. Is it coming up there? Okay. There is nothing there. Okay. All right. So let's look at shamanism as a form of indigenous knowledge, IK, indigenous knowledge. And this is the fourth book that I wrote, Shamanism, an A to Z reference guide. So I'm taking some of it directly from that book that came out 2 years ago. So shamanism, it's a very controversial term. It may have come from Tungus Manchurian, or it may come from Sanskrit. It means to know, and it may also be pre-Siberian in origin. We don't really know. It's come to be applied cross-culturally to a universal ancestral complex that is consistent through time and space. It involves direct contact and communication with the spirit world. So it does not require a priest or a minister for anyone to make direct contact with the spirit world. It also means that you are in control of your spirits. And I can be more specific about this if there are questions, but I'm just going to run through them quickly. One is in control of shamanic states of consciousness, in soul flight, and there's a focus on the physical world to solve everyday problems. And traditionally, shamans worked on behalf of their community. And now, shamanism, as we'll see in a moment, has taken some turns in the modern world. So next slide, please. Then next one. Oh, so there is a chat, and okay, did you find that Indigenous people could articulate these ways that you were describing them? I find sometimes the ability to articulate these overall concepts is very difficult for Indigenous people, but it comes across clearly from what they say. Yes, very much so. These are terms that I'm using as an anthropologist, talking to you as social scientists. But yes, we have to find ways for people to express these in terms that are meaningful to them. And then as an anthropologist, I can become a kind of mediator between the two ways of being. Now, someone said that my voice is not clear. So I'm sorry if but it must be something to do with the transmission.
We can hear you, it's good, I think. No problem.
It's okay, okay. So shamans, through ritual, they exert techniques to influence the material world. And it's a world of polarities. It's a world of male, female, night, day, ordinary reality or non-ordinary reality, the physical world and the spiritual world. And so it's a world of dualities, and shamans keep these worlds in balance. And if there is something going on in the world that's out of balance. It's the role of the shaman to reunite this natural holism. And what's happening today, especially in the West, is this idea of Neo-Shamanism that, and many people, and I've had some as students, are looking at reviving shamanism. The traditional shamanism was on behalf of a community. Neo-Shamanism seems to be more about personal development or personal enlightenment, if I can use that word in this respect. So one of the big issues in that shamans work with is what's called soul loss. And a shaman will go to the other world in order to retrieve a lost soul, which happens so much with trauma. Part of your soul, it's said, part of your soul in a very traumatic situation splits off and goes to hide somewhere until it's safe for it to come back. There's also this idea of three worlds, an upper world, middle world, and a lower world, which in Christianity becomes hell, but did not have that kind of negative connotation in traditional shamanism. There's also this idea of white shamanism compared to sorcery. So there are, in different parts of the world, black shamans, shamans who work with negative energies, who do harm, and there are white shamans who work on behalf of their community, but that might mean fighting against another community in the spirit realm. And this idea of radical participation is something that I came up with from Michael Harner, who said, you can't just do research about shamanism, you have to experience these kinds of things before you can teach about them or write about them. So that's called radical participation rather than just participant observation, which is a classic anthropological approach. Okay, and the next one, please. Can you do the next slide? Scientific knowledge is finally starting to integrate with indigenous knowledge and shamanist ways of knowing. They've often been contradictory, but in the new sciences, such as new physics, scientists are beginning to study what indigenous people have known since time immemorial. And that's the idea of sacred geometry. And the next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So sacred geometry refers to the study of archetypal, original, and universal patterns of which the material world is composed, and that are core patterns of creation. So there are many examples of sacred geometry in the natural world. And I would say that indigenous peoples tend to base their classification systems, even their dwellings, on sacred geometry. And that often comes into conflict with, well, I'll show you in a few of the examples, comes into conflict with, let's say, urbanized Western ideas about how the world operates. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the kinds of things that I was doing when I was a professor. This is a group of my students at Mount Allison, and I had set up for them to map sacred places in the Maritimes that included where sacred plants grew, maybe perhaps where there were burials, pathways that were considered sacred. And this was a way to have university students go out into the field and work with local people. Now, one thing is in Canada, very few Indigenous peoples use the word shaman anymore, although their practices, their beliefs are consistent with shamanic principles. But Christianity has had such an impact now that they use terms like medicine man, medicine woman, healer. And so even, I mean, I have to be careful if I use the word shaman, because Christianity has had such an impact that it can be very frightening to people to use that word. So these are things we have to be very sensitive about. Next slide, please. What's been happening in Canada is a recognition that Indigenous peoples have suffered the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of trauma of any peoples in Canada. And it's now being attributed, these statistics are being attributed to the terrible abuse, that physical, mental, sexual abuse that Indigenous people have suffered in Canada. And there are attempts being made at restitution. For example, Canada, the government of Canada had a policy for many years to de-Indianize the Indian. Residential schools were set up where they were removed from their families, young children. They were removed from their families and sent away to residential schools. They often died there and never returned home. They lost their language. And many of them died and were buried in unmarked graves. So this year, we've been discovering many unmarked graves, some of which housed 700 or more young children at these residential schools. And you may have heard about the Pope's visit. Indigenous leaders have been asking for an apology from the Catholic school, from the Catholic Pope, for an apology for what the Catholic schools did on behalf of the government. They were tasked with this with this terrible policy. But this is not restricted to Canada by any means. It's happened in many of the places that I've worked in. Next slide. So two of my books were on ethnobotany, and both of them documented Indigenous peoples' use of food and medicinal and technology plants used for technology. So, and next slide. So here's one example. I'm working with Blair Leger and Emile Gautreau, who are, I brought them into my university classes to teach in my Indigenous Knowledge Systems course, to teach my students, to interact with my students. and to talk to them about medicinal plants, how they could be used, how plants needed to be restored in the landscape, how many of them had disappeared, and so on. And you can see me in the lower left there. I had the resources. I had tape recorders, cameras. I had publications, things that I could do to document local people's knowledge and also pass that on through lectures, through student assignments. Next one, please. So now I'm just going to quickly go into Southeast Asia with the indigenous peoples there, known as the hill tribes. This is a New Year's ceremony where the women, these are Hmong women, one of the minority groups, and they're having races. So how far can they carry water without spilling it? And it's a wonderful, wonderful, joyous occasion, a New Year celebration. It's also the rice harvest time. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier sacred geometry, and in this case, the sacred geometry is shown in the designs in the clothing, which is specific to each tribal group. Next slide. But each group has its own particular designs and colors. And each of those symbols represents things like, a flower or a mountain, because they are mountain peoples. But they're all geometric designs, and so their identity is in these embroidered clothes that are renewed every year for New Year's. The women sew all year, so that every year, each person, male and female, boy and girl, has a new set of clothing. It's like being reborn in the new year. And then you have to sort of ask, well, what happens to people's cultural identity when they start to wear Western clothing? If they have to go to school and wear Western clothing, or they go to work and it's more acceptable to wear, a suit, jacket, and a tie. Next slide, please. So the hill tribes moved into northern Thailand, where they were given refuge. They were pushed out of Burma, especially, forced out, and moved into northern Thailand, where many of them were incarcerated in refugee camps. So amongst the issues that they're facing, next slide, are issues that refugees experience. They don't have the same land and resources that they had access to. Opium has become a main crop because it's something that has a world market. HIV/AIDS is very prevalent in hill tribe communities because of the poverty and also the lack of care that's available. Prostitution is often the only way for people to make money. Gendering is an issue, of course. And the commoditization of hill tribe clothing, of hill tribe jewelry, of hill tribe ways of being. Ecotourism takes people from all over the world into these villages, and they become sort of, objects of the ecotourism gaze. And it's also led to a diaspora where some of them have moved to other parts of the world where they've been accepted, such as Seattle in the United States, where I was able to interview one of the shamans. Next, please. So this is a hill tribe woman who, she's Aka, and one of the poorest of those of the tribes, and she's wearing all her jewelry around on her clothing. That's also the jewelry, or it was, used to be. And so when they would go into the fields, they would dress like this because if they were being attacked by soldiers and their houses were being burned, they could still travel with their wealth. But this is one of the, next slide, please. But this is one of the quotes that I received when I was talking to people. In Thailand, we were in the camps with wire all around us. There was not enough to eat. We always had to wait in line for food. I remember bags of Thule that people were able to buy, but we were too poor to afford it. And the Thai people let the vendors into the camp to sell things to the Hmong. We would make the needlework to sell for the money, and the relatives would also send us money from overseas. And that way they could afford to buy things from the vendors. Next, please. So embedded in the dominant Thai language are these terms that place the hill tribes in a subservient and lower place. So they have this term tisum titam, which means a high place and a low place. And there's also the Buddhist precept of karma, and this idea of semi-mai, modern times versus new times. So anything old-fashioned is considered barbaric. So the hill tribes are kind of pigeonholed through the Thai language into a place that they're considered to be uncivilized, unsocialized, wild and untamed because they come from the forest, they come from the mountains. And so there's this idea that because of these concepts, the forests, according to the dominant Thai mentality, the forests can be cut down for lowland rice fields to benefit civilization. And of course, this is having a huge impact on the ecology. Next slide, please. And the hill tribes are being charged with destroying the forests, which are being turned into national parks for tourism or into rice fields. Next slide, please. And I did go to see one shaman who is Hmong, and I asked her for a healing. And this might be of interest. I asked her for healing for something that was bothering me, and she said, well, I can't treat you unless you believe in spirits. So this was not something I could just do, casually. So I said, yes, I do believe. I believe in Great Spirit. I believe in spirits. And thus she treated me. And next slide, please. This is a male musician. I'm just going to mention this very quickly because it's male always that performs this music. But this is music to recognize that the spirit world is connected to this world. And that very intricate movement that he's doing with his feet is to confound the spirit so that when he contacts them through his music, they will not come back into the world, into this physical world, and cause harm. Next slide. And this is Sangwik Jamsakol, and he was my translator and guide when I was there. And I said to him, well, why don't you go and do a PhD? And he said, well, the Hmong don't do that. So I said, well, I think you should consider it. And 5 years later, he graduated with a PhD, and I went to his final exam. That was very moving because he had to leave his wife and family for 5 years while he came to school. And he was doing it not for his own personal gain, but to support his family and his entire Hmong community. So he became the second of only 2 Hmong to have PhDs. Next, please. I'm just going to mention this very quickly because I want to leave time for some discussion at the end. Oh, okay. So there, there is a comment that's relevant here. When you did radical participation in shamanic spiritual communities, how do you tend to read phenomena? As superstition or something that actually exists? Can these be somehow measured? Yes, so that's what radical participation is about. I don't talk about anything in shamanism. I don't teach anything in shamanism unless I've experienced it. So I have experienced the 3 worlds. I have experienced helping spirits. I have done soul retrievals for people. I have had a soul retrieval done for myself. So no, they're not about superstition. They are, in my view, these exist. And it's the same thing, I suppose, in religion. You know, does one know that heaven exists? You know it or you don't. Spirit exists. That's how. So that's why I ended up taking Michael Herner's 3-year training, and also became a teacher myself, because there's so much to learn about reality from traditional shamanism. So I want to quickly just talk about the reindeer herders of Thule. So I'm going to go to the next slide just to show you. They're reindeer herders. They ride the reindeer. They milk the reindeer for their food. They rarely kill a reindeer. A reindeer is considered to be sacred. Next slide, please. And they live in tents year round, even in the winter. This is June when we were there. There was some snow. But their conical ger, or tent, is based on this idea of a circle. And one can just imagine, because I haven't got time to go into more explanation, but let us just imagine what happens to the social arrangements when people move from a teepee style design, a conical design, into a square building or a rectangular building in town, so their children can go to school. Next slide, please. And this is Chulu on the left. She's a reindeer herder. She said to me when I was interviewing her, she said to me, "You are very beautiful." And I said, "Oh no, you are very beautiful because your life is written on your face." And she's a very, very lovely woman who, when she was young, was too weak to be a shaman. She had some illness, but she's in the shamanic line. So her parents and her grandparents were shamans, and her son on the right is practicing shaman. And this is a very, next slide, please. And this is one of the quotes that I refer to so often. Next slide. Because she spoke to me about this flower, and they actually gave me one of these flowers to bring home. There's a flower called Wansamburu. We use them in many ways. I only collect from June the 20th to July the 5th. So that's when the flower has got the most energy of the sun. During this period, the flower hasn't fully bloomed, so it's still closed, so it's containing its energy. And I don't collect the flower, so she doesn't pull the flower, collect it, but I bring people who are sick to the flower, and that's quite an expedition because these flowers grow high up in the mountains. So it's a journey to get there. And on top of it, of the flower, are drops of dew, tiny drops of moisture. My father used to tell me, don't use all of the dew, just one drop. So this is the basis of homeopathic medicine. The first time I used a spoon and it was hard. The second time I drew the water up with a syringe. So she found a new way to collect easily. And she gave a drop to her son, who was very sick, not even a year old. And his lungs were very bad. And she carried him all the way to the flower for 3 days at the end of June. I had to climb up the mountain. I took my son 3 times to that flower, once a day. After 3 visits, my father told me, now your son's going to be good. He killed a reindeer and made fresh soup for my son. Now that's very unusual. They will only kill a reindeer because the reindeer is their family's, the whole community's life. But they will kill a reindeer in extreme circumstances. So when he killed the reindeer, he took a bit of every part of the reindeer, put it into the intestines and boiled them. And this is so much a part of indigenous knowledge, is that if you use a plant, you might use all parts of the plant. If you kill a reindeer, you're using all parts of the reindeer because that's what gives the reindeer its strength. I gave soup to my son and little bits of meat, and he got better and is growing. So this is a very different way of looking at using a plant for healing instead of going to the pharmacy and, picking up an aspirin. Next slide, please. So the reindeer herders are facing, one of the big issues they're facing is climate change. It's warming, and the reindeer do not do well in warmer weather. So what's going to happen to them in 20 years, 30 years? They're probably going to have to move down the mountain and live in the lower areas, and probably will become sheep herders instead of reindeer herders. And yet there's a great lesson to learn from them, because I learned, when I went there, I would say, well, what do the Duka, that's their name, the Russian name, what do the Duka think about the practice of shamanic healing? And I learned very quickly that you don't ask a general question like that. You ask, because people don't talk about another person's experience. They just talk about their own experience. So I had to rephrase a lot of my work. And I have to do that regardless of where I am. And next slide, please. So I think I have, perhaps I just have a couple of minutes. Would you like to see the video, or do you want me to speak about Goa in India? Maybe that, I don't want to go over my time. or perhaps we should see if there's any questions or any discussion. And if there's a few minutes at the end, I could show the last couple of slides.
Do you want to play the video now first?
Well, I can just show you the circle dance. Yes, I think I'll just do it for a minute or two. Because this is what I call radical participation. I was trying to film this circle dance and people took my camera away. Okay, people took my camera away so that I could dance instead. So I got a very different experience. And it's a group of shamans who came together in Russia outside Moscow. Yes, can you put it up? And so it's important because the circle, as I said before, is a universal symbol of unity. And it's about the cyclical nature of existence. So the circle, of course, has no beginning, no end. And through the circle dance, the cosmogenic structure of the universe is preserved. And each person participating in the circle dance recreates the cosmos through their everyday activity. So there's a note saying we can see the video. So if you can put the video up.
Yes,
do that?
Please, Ranjit, please. Yes, you can play the video. Thanks.
Okay. And the other thing I think is so interesting about this video is there are people from all over Russia, shamans and healers from all over Russia, but the leadership is what I would call emergent. So the person who takes the lead in the singing, it starts out with this shaman. It starts out with this shaman because this is his land. But but then someone else takes over, and then someone else takes over.
Хороводы, да? Хороводы у них. Пожалуйста, станьте хороводы. Немножко вот сюда.
Kata kunji jalin janal, kata kunji jalin janal. Ukat kokon sama celap, ukat kokon sama celap. Jalle henco, 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 jalle henco. Ayah mama jara kallo, ayah mama jara kallo. Okat kokon jalin jagat, okat kokon jalin jagat. Jalle henco, jalle henco, jalle henco, jalle henco. Jalin jalla yukat kokon, jalin jalla yukat kokon. Jalle henco, jalle henco, jalle henco, jalle.
Yes, sister. So you heard me saying something like, "Oh no, I've got to do that. I've got to." And eventually somebody just took my camera and I was the only Western woman there. There was some Japanese visitors, a lot of Russians, obviously, but everybody was included. Everybody participated. And it taught me a lot about inclusiveness, about the cosmogenic structure being enacted out in a dance like this. So I think I'll leave it there and see if anyone has any comments or anything they'd like to add to the discussion. Are there 147 of you out there? Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
Ranjit, you can unmute and say your question if you want. Personally, I have just one question. One question is in India we have a lot of tribal communities, and the question is, and we have a lot of students here, and I would like to know what recommendation you would give to them in terms of posture or how to approach them, things not to do. Mainly, actually, when we are interacting with people, the most important thing is to know what you should not do in order to develop, in fact, the culture of the heart and be able to communicate with the people. What would be your recommendations? Or how were you approaching the people? Because we saw also different type of culture, different type of tribes. Was there any things which were common and things which were specific to each of them? I would like to have your point of view on that.
Well, I mean, I don't need to tell you India is very complex. And so you would have more insights into differences and similarities than I would. But I think it, as any anthropologist has to do, you have to do some background information. You've got to make a personal contact with the group. But saying that, you have to be careful who your contact is, because different contacts might have different agendas for you. So you have to be careful who you align yourself with initially. You also have to think about what's the social structure in that particular group. Is there a head person? It's usually a head man. Can you find somebody who knows that before you go in? There's so much preparation to do. A lot of it, I think, has to do with one's attitude when you go in. What am I here to do? Am I here to promote my own agenda, which may be fine? You may be doing a PhD or a master's, and so you do have an agenda. Or are you there to see what their needs are in terms of some kind of development project? So it's a very, very broad question, and I'm not sure I can give you an easy answer, except to, people are people everywhere, and everyone wants to be recognized and respected for who they are.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's the chat. It's a great, if I heard it right, are you asking about Neo-Shamanism? Neo-Sham is more about, yes. Well, this is a very insightful question here, because yes, I think in North America, especially, many people are going out and doing shamanic this and shamanic that. And one thing I should say is shamanic work can be very dangerous for the practitioner, for the shaman, and also for the people who are going for help. It's not just about healing. It can also be very dangerous. So the daughter of Chulu had been doing a soul retrieval for a client, and the negative energy, or what we would call the the intrusion, jumped from the client into the shaman, and she became schizophrenic. So I think with neo-shamanism, a lot of people are fooling around and doing things that are potentially very dangerous for themselves without a good grounding in traditional shamanism, where people have many generations of experience. So the rest of this is, how can we incorporate or integrate the indigenous shamanic knowledge in the neoliberal world where everything is materialized? Yes, it's a very difficult question, but what's happening in North America with places like the Foundation for Shamanic Studies is traditional shamans are being recognized, they're being supported, they're being given sometimes funding to support them. Yeah. So there are organizations that are trying to revive traditional shamanism. Yeah. I hope I'm answering these questions. So there's a new message here. Can we relate shamanism to panchakarma? I'm not going to do that because I know very little about panchakarma personally. I would, if you are familiar with it, we could certainly see what the connections might be. But it's not my field of experience.
Dr. Marilyn, it seems there was one question about India that was just before. Shall I read it out to you?
Is it further up?
Yeah, it's there in the chat just before it. Like, question is about India from Ranjit Menon. How does one draw boundaries to the term?
Yes. Right. How does one draw boundaries to the term indigenous or shaman and Indian or so many entrenched contain the beliefs? Yes. Well, there's so this is the case in many parts of the world where traditional shamanism, which is the ancestral spiritual practice of all peoples, has now become overlaid with Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and many forms of Christianity as well. And so there is an entanglement, but at the same time, shamanism and indigenous knowledge systems are also evolving and incorporating different and newer ways of being. So in India, would the term be then in Indian context against the majority, against the formal knowledge systems? Against formal economy. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at any of the groups that you're considering and see, well, what shamanic traditions are still being practiced, or how have they integrated with those practices or beliefs of the dominant religious or social system. Majority informal knowledge systems, yeah. So I don't know if I've answered that very well. If I could hear you, you can't unmute.
Yeah, I can unmute now. I think it was just a problem back then.
Okay, so
yeah, it was what you said was very relevant. I was just wondering if you have to sort of map what is not shamanism to understand shamanism better in when you have such an entangled context like in India. So if you go to the Northeast, there is like very strong division between the shaman cultures and maybe the mainstream society. But then if you come maybe to some other parts, it might be very entangled. And for like someone from a foreign country, they might perceive some of the mainstream Hindu practices as might be mistakenly categorized maybe as like shamanism, and maybe we don't perceive it like that. So there was just this question, like, then how would you draw the boundaries to identify that which ones would be indigenous? Again, this goes to the question of like, then who do you map it against? Like, would it be mapping against something that is formalized and mainstream practiced by some majority, so you tend to always have a minority status of some sort? So anyway, it was a very open question, so I don't think there is any one approach to this answer, but yeah.
And I guess it depends on the intent of your study. You know, what is it that what is the question, or what are the questions, or that you're trying to answer? But yes, I mean, India, you know much more about it than I could ever encompass. So, but it's very much the same situation even in Canada. You know, there are some people who, as an outsider, you might say, well, that's a shamanic practice, but people in the culture, they don't want it. They don't even use the term shaman anymore. So you might say it's an indigenous spiritual practice. But then I might see connections to what's going on in Siberia. And yeah, it's very, very complex, as you pointed out.
Yeah, just to add on that, I was just wondering if you you probably have encountered this book called Shamanism and Tantra in the Himalayas. It's by, I think, German anthropologist Christian Rasch. I had read it like 10 years ago.
Yes.
I was wondering, yeah.
Wonderful book. Yeah.
I was wondering if that is an example of radical participation, or is it just normal anthropology?
No, I would say that's a good example of radical participation. I mean, you know, it's a term that Michael Harner at the Institute for Shamanic Studies, the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, excuse me, developed. And in some places, for example, in the Amazon, radical participation means doing ayahuasca. Radical participation to me means participating in the dance rather than photographing it. And certainly that book is an example of radical participation. It's an amazing book. It did an incredible job. And they also got a lot of at a lot of the complexities of the mixing up of, let's call them classical shamanic practices and techniques, but integrated or with Buddhism, for example. And one of the examples that I was going to really mention briefly was the Tibetan Bon tradition, which is unusual because it's a shamanic tradition, but it's a written tradition. So because most shamanic cultures are oral traditions, and the Tibetan Bon tradition, which you would know about, which originated in Tibet and is now in exile in northern India.
I will ask you a question. Okay.
Knowledge is transmitted by a written text. So there is a great deal of variation amongst shamanic cultures or cultures that have a shamanic tradition. But thank you for that question and your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Marilyn.
I think we have a few more questions, Dr. Marilyn.
Okay, I've got one here. Can you explain the different camp settings in different cultures? I would have to ask for a bit of clarification about that. If you could.
Yeah. Good morning, Marilyn. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. So, like for my doctoral research, I have done it based on one particular tribe from Kerala. Through indigenous research, I have used indigenous methodology as my research tool through discourse analysis, like narrative methods and oral histories I have analyzed. So, from your discussion, I came to understand that like shamanism is also a kind of protective shield for the indigenous community. Like they've been practicing their indigenous knowledge, like they don't need any kind of colonized person or some other outsiders to tell them like how they have to preserve what they know for centuries. So in the community, like Panya is a community in Kerala, one indigenous community in Kerala in the bygone days who experienced bondage and slavery, and as part of the government intervention it's been abolished afterwards, but earlier they've been auctioned as slaves, something similar to apartheid. So during that time, while we explore more oral histories, it's been written down that like they used animism as a protective shield to escape from their oppressors, like the ability to change their shapes or something. Like they won't literally change their shape, but something similar to that. So the violence, sexual violence, as you explained, like the trauma, sexual violence experienced within their community, they've been able to surpass all those with the help of animism, their belief and trust in the religious worship of like natural resources, as you mentioned. So my thing is like I never imagined the concept of shamanism in my research field, but while listening to your discussions and discourses, I think like shamanism is also somewhat similar to animism, but I don't know how well I can comprehend that. So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, okay, thank you. So animism, you know, historically would precede shamanism, but it's certainly part of it. I mean, animism is a belief in spirits and in the animation of the material world and animation. So the shamanism traditionally meant that there would be a shaman or shamans to help mediate the two worlds. But then in many places, the shamans have disappeared. So then it becomes a kind of a question, well, then is it really a shamanic tradition? So, you know, your question's an interesting one. And it may be that you're working in a culture where they don't even use the word shaman, but they still share the same beliefs because they're animistic.
Yeah, yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
So shamanism, of course, believes that everything in the world is animated. You know, everything from the wind to the rocks, to a tree, to a stone, to the sky, to everything has a spirit. And so a shaman can, or even you don't have to be a shaman to be able to make a connection with these spirits and to ask for their help on behalf of problems in this world, as you mentioned that people in your community of study did. They used it to preserve themselves. Yeah. Yes. Anyway, your project sounds really. I hope if I get back to Kerala, I'll be able to meet you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
As you mentioned, some type of crisis. Yes. Some awareness program. So, yeah, so I was working in the hill tribe communities with Songwit Chuamsakul. And so what I was doing with him was supporting the work that he was doing through I think it's called the Tribal Institute, it was called, where yes, they are doing programs to provide alternative means of employment, but it was very difficult because they're a minority, and as I said, that the Thai language divides them from what are called the real Thai. But yes, there are many organizations in Thailand working on behalf of the hill tribes to try and find solutions to some of those problems. And some Transical, when he got his PhD, was able to go back and contribute.
Ma'am, can we leave? നീ മാത്രല്ല എല്ലാരും
The participants to please keep their mics muted.
So should I answer this question next? Do the indigenous knowledge system face any sort of drawbacks because it is a dynamic system of knowledge, as is any cultural system. And at the same time, it uses traditional techniques to deal with new challenges. As I said about Chulu and the Dukkha, she is using a hypodermic needle to draw up the dew because she lost less of it. So people are always, all people are always looking for new opportunities, new ways of being. Yeah, to benefit themselves and to benefit their families. And that's certainly true of indigenous knowledge systems. At the same time, there has to be some sort of continuity rather than an abrupt traumatic break. I think I answered that one. I didn't answer. Yes, and I do have to say that Michael Harner, he's passed away now, but the Foundation for Shamanic Studies is providing scholarships and financial help and setting up conferences for shamans to attend and renew their linkages with shamans in other parts of the world. And there are other organizations doing the same thing to try and preserve the knowledge and also make it more vital to the present day. I think have I answered all the questions?
I had one more question, Dr. Marilyn.
Okay.
Yeah, it was about the terms that we use in gender equality, which is patriarchy and women's empowerment. So when you look at these particular indigenous contexts, do some of these terms need to be improved or recontextualized? This is strictly in terms of, let's say, the freedom of opportunity that comes with a certain economic upliftment of the society. So do these terms then become valid suddenly when you try to solve a specific problem when it comes to economic uplifting of a certain community or something like that?
Well, I think they're useful terms. I mean, even in Canada, I would say I live in a patriarchal system. I think my university is patriarchal. There's gender inequality, that's pervasive. So it's a useful term. But it's probably not a term that most indigenous communities would use. So, and you know, the first thing that came to mind when you used that term was, I was talking to actually Tatiana, the woman who's on the poster, and she said the first shamans were women. And some people say that most powerful shamans are women. So in Siberia and Mongolia, and Siberia in particular, there are male shamans and there are female shamans. And neither one is considered stronger. But also in shamanism, some people have told me that a shaman has to be both male and female. And I found that very interesting in terms of this sort of language, this gendered language, such as patriarchy. So I don't know if that answers, it is relevant to your comment.
Yeah, it is actually. Thank you. So just to build on that, I was wondering if in the Western context, which is the pre-Christian context, is there something that let's say the Western world could go back to? So what I generally observe is there is practices from other cultures being adopted to explore, let's say, non-Christian spiritual context and shamanic traditions. But within the West, is there anything that people could look and go back to, like as a pre-Christian situation?
Yes, well, certainly, you know, as I said, there's been such an impact of Christianity in Canada, especially Roman Catholicism, that people don't even, like Indigenous people themselves, many of them don't want to use the word shaman because it was really forbidden by the church. I mean, and the Russian Orthodox Church made terrible examples of shamans in Alaska to take away their power because they were seen as a threat to the colonizers. And now I've lost my train of thought. However, you know, yes, you can go way back into archaeology. So when I was working as an archaeologist in the far north, we did find what we would have to call shamanic tools that go way, way back to Thule and then Dorset and pre-Dorset peoples. And those peoples probably migrated across the old Bering Sea area from Central Asia. And so we found things like tiny daggers that were used for killing bad energies. We found little tiny bears that were used as the shamans' way to travel to the other world. So yes, you can, and even in Goa when I was there was an archaeologist, an anthropologist who was looking at rock art as examples of shamanic techniques. So yes, you can go way back in history to find things that are pre-Christian in Canada and elsewhere. Yeah. I mean, there's some really interesting. There's some very interesting sites in Canada that have just come out in, say, the last 20 years of huge rock formations where Indigenous peoples were charting the celestial movements in a similar way to they were doing in Stonehenge back then. But one big site had been covered over by a farmer's field. So we're discovering all the time that there's much history in the land that you know, has just been hidden for a long time.
Yeah, thank you.
So there is one question here. Could you please, I don't think I answered this one. Could you please explain which programs could help preserve Indigenous knowledge in the formal education system? Yes, and this was something I was very interested in when I was professor. And one thing I did was I would bring in elders, traditional elders, into the classroom and have them teach for me, teach my students, rather than me being the intermediary. They would come in and talk about their own practices, their own culture themselves. And we also held conferences at the universities on Indigenous knowledge, and had people come in and present papers themselves, because there are many Indigenous people who are scholars as well. And I think it's also important for students to have the opportunity to go into outside of the classroom and into Indigenous communities themselves, and perhaps offer their skills in research or writing to support community initiated research projects. I mean, people can be identified as adjunct professors, for example. You don't need to have a formal degree for that to be, for that appointment. So you could appoint a traditional healer or a traditional plant medicine knowledge keeper as an adjunct professor in your university, and have them receive that kind of recognition in the formal system. So I have one question for you. It looks like I have 136 participants. Is that right?
Wasn't there
That's amazing.
a classroom in the back that there might have been more students with groups, sir? Wasn't there a full classroom? Meaning there would be more than the people signed up?
All right. Did I answer all the questions? I'm not sure. I think I did.
Yeah, I think, ma'am, we might have a few more, but because of this time constraints, could be like pick it up and like maybe share with you later, so that we could get the answers from you for those questions which might have been missed or so.
Okay. Yes, of course.
Thank you, ma'am.
So I think if you would like to finish now, is that? I've lost track of the time myself.
Yes, ma'am.
It's now 11:10, but actually it was very so interesting. So many questions. I'm very surprised. So it's beautiful. The question is that I don't know if you have finished your slides, or if we can, because I don't know what is the constraints also of all the people who are attending, because it was initially scheduled till 11. So I don't know exactly how we should do. Maybe, as Parvati said, that if there are some questions, then we can make it open and then have the students, everybody who wants to ask you a question, to send us a question, and then you can answer like this.
Yes, that would be fine. You could forward to the last slide, if you wouldn't mind. A couple more. And one more. And the one before, yes. So thank you very much, everyone. These are different names that I've received. So depending on where I am in the world, I get called Dr. Walker, Dr. Marilyn, Professor Walker, Professor Marilyn. When I was working with the Inuit, I was called Pitsulok because I had a tendency to walk around all over the place. My name in New Brunswick from the Métis is Kipu or Great Eagle. And of course, my Amma name is Maheshwari. So I'm happy to be called any of those names. And if you are interested, I've given you very short summaries of some of my publications, but you can see some of my articles on shamanism at MarilynWalkerProductions.com, and you'll see a section there on shamanism for some of the published articles. If there were any that were of interest for you to follow up on. But I'm also happy to receive any emails or other correspondence if anything else has come up. And I just would like to thank all of you there for organizing such a wonderful opportunity for me to meet you all virtually. And perhaps next year I may meet you, some of you in person, if I make it back to Anthropology.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Marilyn, for this very informative and exciting session. If we are closing, I would like to give our thanks note here. So we indeed appreciate this very insightful examples and experiences that you have shared, as well as the very subtle concepts of working with Indigenous community, the challenges they face, the methodologies that we can use. It was very insightful, and we look forward to more such sessions and exchange of knowledge. I thank you once again for this wonderful and insightful session that you have offered us. I also thank our Dean, Dr. Bhavani Rao, for this opportunity for us to participate in this session. And I also thank the organizers from Amrita School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the technical team, for coordinating the event. And thank you, the wonderful audience, for their interest and active participation.